There are people who don't sleep at night, not because they don't want to, but because their mind refuses silence. Their thoughts loop like a film reel: memories, possibilities, dangers, conversations that never happened, warnings for events that may never occur. And society calls them anxious. They call themselves broken. But the truth is much darker, much more beautiful. These people are genius thinkers disguised as worriers. An anxious mind is not chaotic, it is hyper-aware. It scans reality like a radar system built for war, trained by experience, conditioned by emotional wounds. Long before they ever knew what fear was, their nervous system was memorizing everything: tone shifts, facial expressions, silence that meant danger, affection that came with conditions. They learned to think fast because slow thinking once meant pain. Anxiety is not stupidity, it is intelligence born in survival. You don't overthink because you're weak. You overthink because once upon a time, you had to. And that brilliant, restless mind you carry, it is not malfunctioning, it is protecting you from ghosts it still believes are real. An anxious mind doesn't simply worry, it analyzes, scans, and calculates. What looks like overthinking from the outside often feels like survival on the inside. People with anxiety don't just process information, they absorb it like a radar system, constantly sweeping the environment for shifts, cues, and potential threats. Their nervous system functions like a supercomputer, running thousands of subconscious assessments before their conscious mind even forms a sentence. Tone, posture, silence, hesitation, facial micro-expressions, things most people overlook, become signals that must be decoded. This heightened awareness isn't random, and it isn't a defect, it's adaptation. It's the body's response to environments where unpredictability meant danger, where emotional instability trained the nervous system to stay alert, even when the body was tired. Trauma doesn't always leave scars on the skin, it leaves patterns in the nervous system. The body learned, if I can predict danger, I can avoid harm. If I can notice the smallest signs of disappointment or anger, I can protect myself. What began as a survival strategy becomes a default operating system. The problem is that the nervous system doesn't know the danger is gone. Even in safe environments, the body still acts as if something could collapse at any moment. Soft voices feel suspicious, long pauses feel threatening, neutral expressions feel like rejection. The supercomputer brain continues running simulations, predicting worst-case scenarios not because the person wants to, but because at one point in their life, failing to predict meant pain. And yet, within this hyper-vigilance lies a remarkable gift. The same sensitivity that once protected becomes intuition. People with anxiety often read rooms deeply. They can feel shifts in energy, detect dishonesty, understand unspoken emotions, and sense discomfort before words appear. Empathy becomes a natural language. Their mind doesn't just think, it perceives. But the nervous system cannot run at full power forever. Constant alertness drains energy, confidence, and peace. The same supercomputer that saves them also exhausts them. Anxiety is the nervous system asking, am I safe yet? Has the danger passed? Can I stop scanning now? And the body, conditioned by memory rather than logic, continues answering, not yet. Healing doesn't mean shutting the system down. It means teaching it that life is no longer a battlefield. It means reminding the body that it doesn't have to earn safety by anticipating everything. It means slowly unlearning survival mode and learning presence. The nervous system softens not through force, but through safety, consistency, and compassion. In time, the supercomputer can remain powerful without being hyper-vigilant. It can become a tool, not a shield. The mind that once scanned for danger can instead scan for truth, connection, meaning, and beauty. And when that happens, anxiety transforms into awareness, and survival becomes peace. What many people call overthinking is often something far deeper and more complex, a highly attuned nervous system interpreting cues most people never notice. It isn't chaos, it's precision. The mind isn't spinning because it's confused, it's spinning because it's gathering, sorting, and decoding information at a pace that feels overwhelming. Overthinking is what happens when intuition and survival instincts collide with unresolved fear. For someone who has lived through emotional unpredictability, whether through trauma, inconsistency, neglect, or betrayal, the brain learns to anticipate rather than simply experience. It becomes trained to listen not only to words, but to tone, pauses, energy, and silence. That voice in your head that won't quiet down isn't a flaw, it's the echo of a time when paying attention kept you safe. Hyper-intuition develops when the nervous system has had to become its own alarm system. That's why certain things bother you before they make sense. You sense distance before someone admits they're pulling away. You feel tension before conflict surfaces. You see the lies under polite smiles. Your mind races because it knows something is off, even if you don't have the full picture yet. The discomfort doesn't come from being wrong, it comes from being right too soon. This kind of intuition is sharp enough to detect micro signals, a subtle shift in someone's eyes, a change in the rhythm of a text conversation, hesitation in a response, a forced laugh. While others live comfortably in assumptions, you live in patterns. Your brain compares past behavior to present action, searching for meaning. You're not overreacting, you're recognizing what others overlook, but there's a cost. When hyper-intuition doesn't have a safe outlet, it turns inward. Instead of interpreting the world, it begins questioning itself. Thoughts loop, not because your mind is irrational, but because it's unfinished. It has data but not answers. It feels the shift but doesn't have the explanation. So it keeps searching, replaying conversations, analyzing expressions, predicting outcomes. This is where intuition becomes anxiety, not because the intuition is inaccurate, but because the mind has learned that being right doesn't guarantee safety or clarity. The pain isn't in the knowing, it's in the waiting. Waiting for people to reveal their true intention. Waiting for honesty that may never come. Waiting for the world to match what your nervous system already sensed. Healing isn't about shutting off intuition. It's about teaching the nervous system that constant vigilance is no longer necessary. When safety becomes familiar rather than rare, intuition stops being a warning siren and starts being a quiet inner compass. The sensitivity remains, but it no longer hurts. Overthinking isn't mental chaos, it's unspoken truth, waiting for validation. It's the nervous system remembering what your conscious mind has tried to forget. And one day, when trust replaces fear, you'll realize you were never too much. You were simply tuned in. And your intuition was never the problem, only the environments where you had to survive with it. Attachment isn't random, it's learned. The way someone loves, trusts, and connects in adulthood is often shaped long before they understand what love even means. For anxious individuals, love was not a steady experience. It was a shifting landscape of warmth one moment and distance the next. Their emotional blueprint was formed in environments where attention had to be earned, affection had to be performed for, and connection felt fragile rather than guaranteed. When a child experiences inconsistency, care followed by absence, affection followed by silence, the nervous system becomes wired for uncertainty. Love becomes something to monitor, not something to rest in. The child learns to listen for emotional weather changes, to adjust behavior to avoid abandonment, and to anticipate disconnection before it happens. Their body learns that love is conditional, not because it truly is, but because unpredictability taught them survival. As adults, this blueprint becomes attachment anxiety. They love intensely, not because they are clingy, but because their nervous system still believes love can disappear without warning. What looks like neediness is really fear of repeating old wounds, fear of being forgotten, fear of being too late to hold on to connection. They search for reassurance because as children, reassurance was rarely offered, it had to be chased. The most painful part is that the heart often seeks what once hurt it. The familiar becomes attractive, not because it's healthy, but because the nervous system recognizes the pattern. So they gravitate toward emotionally unavailable people, confusing unpredictability with passion and distance with depth. They don't chase because they don't understand their worth. They chase because their blueprint taught them love requires pursuit. Yet beneath this anxious attachment lies a remarkable sensitivity. These individuals love wholeheartedly. They notice changes, remember details, and care with an intensity that comes from longing. They see connection as sacred because they know what it feels like to lose it. Their fear isn't of commitment, it's of being invisible, ignored, or replaced. What they crave isn't constant attention, it's emotional safety. Healing begins when the blueprint is rewritten, not through force, but through new experiences. When love becomes consistent instead of conditional, when presence replaces unpredictability, when someone doesn't walk away when things get heavy. Slowly, the nervous system learns it doesn't need to chase to be chosen. It begins to relax. The body stops bracing for loss, and the heart stops performing for worthiness. Over time, anxious attachment transforms, not into indifference, but into secure connection. Love becomes something they can breathe in, not something they must fear losing. And the greatest realization emerges: they were never too much. They simply learned to love in response to inconsistency. And now, with awareness and healing, they have the power to choose relationships where love isn't a chase, but a home. Self-doubt isn't weakness, it's protection. For many people, especially those raised in emotionally unpredictable environments, questioning themselves became safer than risking disapproval. As children, they learned that being wrong came with consequences: anger, withdrawal, shame, or disappointment. So instead of expressing their needs, emotions, or opinions freely, they learned to shrink. Silence became armor, and invisibility became survival. When a child grows up constantly monitored, criticized, or expected to meet invisible emotional standards, their nervous system internalizes a simple rule: it's dangerous to be confident. Confidence invites attention, and attention wasn't safe. So the mind adapted. It learned to second-guess thoughts before speaking them. It learned to replay conversations to look for mistakes. It learned to apologize even when nothing was wrong. Not because the child was unsure, but because being overly cautious meant avoiding pain. Over time, this cautiousness becomes identity. The adult doesn't say, "I feel uncertain." They say, "This is just who I am." But beneath that identity sits a protective system still trying to prevent rejection. Self-doubt becomes automatic. What if I'm wrong? What if I upset someone? What if I fail? What if I'm not enough? To outsiders, self-doubt looks like low confidence. But internally it feels like scanning for danger. The nervous system remembers moments where speaking up led to embarrassment, or where needs were ignored or criticized. Doubt becomes a filter. Every action, choice, and feeling must pass through it before being allowed into the world. And yet, the paradox is striking: the most self-doubting people are often the ones with the strongest awareness, intuition, and emotional intelligence. They think deeply not because they are unsure, but because their nervous system has been trained to assess every angle. They want to get things right, not out of perfectionism, but out of fear that mistakes make them unlovable. Healing begins not with forcing confidence, but with understanding where doubt was born. The body needs to learn that making mistakes is human, not dangerous. That expressing feelings won't lead to abandonment. That their voice has value, not because it is flawless, but because it is theirs. Slowly, self-doubt can shift. Instead of being a wall that blocks self-worth, it can become a signal, an invitation to pause, reflect, and choose differently. The nervous system must experience new patterns, being heard, seen, and accepted without punishment. Confidence isn't built by shouting over doubt, it's built by proving, gently and repeatedly, that fear is no longer necessary. In time, the inner voice that once whispered "be careful" begins to soften into "you're allowed to exist." And when that happens, the person realizes something powerful: there was nothing wrong with them. They never lacked confidence, they were simply protecting themselves. Self-doubt was never a flaw. It was a response to a world that made authenticity feel unsafe. And healing is the journey of finally becoming visible to others and, more importantly, to oneself. What looks like fear is often a mind traveling far beyond the visible edges of the present. When an anxious person imagines 1,000 bad outcomes, they're not only rehearsing worst-case scenarios, they're mapping enormous terrain. Every fearful image contains a contour of possibility. Every catastrophic thought is a road the imagination has drawn and walked, so that if it ever appears in reality, the mind will already know how to move. This is not scarcity of creativity, it's abundance with a safety bias. Anxiety and creativity share anatomy. The same neural circuits that generate hypothetical futures are responsible for storytelling, metaphor, and artistic invention. A brain that simulates outcomes in intense, vivid detail can just as easily simulate a novel, a business idea, or a new way to hold a conversation. The mind that conjures disaster is using the raw materials of creativity, pattern recognition, emotional coloring, and a propensity to connect distant dots. Put differently, the nervous system that fears is the nervous system that can imagine. Consider how a writer inhabits characters' fears and hopes, or how an inventor imagines failures before building a prototype. Both practices require the capacity to run through permutations, to play out scenarios that do not yet exist. An anxious imagination does this constantly without assignment. That relentless what-if engine becomes a workshop where fine-grained detail is constructed: moods, facial micro-expressions, the micro-timing of speech, the subtle shifts in a room's energy. While this can feel exhausting, it also equips the individual with acute sensitivity and richness of inner life. There's also a moral creativity in anxious minds. Many people who feel deeply troubled by injustice, climate dread, or relational fragility are moved into action precisely because their imagination refuses to be complacent. They can see consequences before others do. They feel empathy because they simulate suffering so vividly. That sensitivity fuels art, advocacy, and innovation. The grief-laden imagination often produces work that resonates because it has already lived inside many possible human stories. The problem is not the imagination itself, it's the interpretive lens. When the mind labels every possibility as threat, creativity becomes tiring and tethered to avoidance. The same faculty that paints extraordinary scenes can trap the person in loops that shrink rather than expand life. The task of healing, then, is to retune interpretation without dulling imaginative capacity, to teach the nervous system that some possibilities are invitations, not alarms. Practically, this means cultivating practices that let the imagination play in safe ways. Guided daydreaming, expressive writing, art-making, improvisational exercises, these give the mind sanctioned space to explore without immediate consequence. Mindfulness and grounding don't stop images from arising, they change how images are held. Instead of believing every scenario must be defended against, the person learns to be curious about the worlds their mind builds and selective about which ones deserve action. In time, the landscape shifts, the imagination remains vast, and now it is freer. Fear becomes one brush among many colors. The mind that once rehearsed dangers can now rehearse beauty, possibility, connection, and solution. What was survival becomes resource. Their imagination was never meant to be tamed, it was meant to be guided. And when it is, the result is not less sensitivity, but deeper creativity, richer empathy, and a life more fully imagined. Desire is often misunderstood. From the outside, it may look like longing, neediness, or pursuit. But beneath every deep desire lies a story, a memory of what was missing, withheld, or inconsistently given. When someone fiercely wants connection, safety, or belonging, it isn't simply craving another person. It's their inner child holding out empty hands and asking a quiet, trembling question. Will someone finally choose me? For those who grew up with emotional distance or unpredictable affection, desire becomes a language of survival. Their nervous system still remembers the ache of being overlooked or misunderstood. They learned early that love was not guaranteed, that connection could vanish, that affection could turn cold, that being emotionally seen was rare. So now, when they desire closeness, it isn't superficial hunger, it's an old wound resurfacing, asking for closure, recognition, and warmth. Desire isn't excess, it's evidence. It tells the truth the adult self tries to hide, that at some point, love wasn't stable, and so wanting becomes both an ache and a hope. It is the body remembering what it didn't receive and reaching toward the possibility that something different exists now. This longing is not a flaw, it is a map pointing toward healing. When someone longs for connection, they aren't weak. They are courageous. It takes bravery to want after loss, to reach after rejection, to hope after disappointment. Desire means the heart hasn't given up. It continues to believe in the possibility of being held, understood, and valued. But the pain of desire comes from the fear attached to it. The fear that if they express what they need, they'll be too much. The fear that if they ask to be chosen, they'll be dismissed. The fear that no one will stay once they see the depth of the longing. So instead of speaking openly, they often carry the desire quietly, waiting for someone who can read them without asking, someone who will stay without needing proof. The truth, however, is this desire is not a burden. It is truth-seeking recognition. The heart does not want perfection, it wants presence. It wants to feel safe enough to rest. It wants to trust that connection doesn't have an expiration date. The wound simply asks, is there a place where I don't have to earn love? Healing begins when the person stops treating their desire as a flaw, when they understand that yearning for connection is human, not shameful, when they stop apologizing for wanting to be chosen and begin acknowledging that longing itself is sacred. In time, desire can transform from desperation into clarity, into knowing what kind of love feels safe, mutual, and true. The wound remains part of the story, but no longer defines the present, and eventually, the whisper changes. Instead of asking, will someone choose me? It becomes a steadier truth. I am worthy of being chosen, and I no longer chase what cannot stay. Many people imagine healing as a destination where the mind becomes silent, where thoughts disappear and nothing feels overwhelming anymore. But true healing doesn't erase the mind's voice, it changes its tone. It doesn't demand silence, it invites gentleness. The mind that once echoed with alarm, fear, or uncertainty doesn't suddenly go quiet. It learns to breathe. It learns that urgency isn't always necessary. It learns that not every thought is a threat. The racing mind developed for a reason. At some point, scanning, predicting, replaying, and overanalyzing were forms of protection. The child who lived in an unpredictable environment needed that constant vigilance. They needed to watch the door before someone entered the room. They needed to sense tone shifts before anger erupted. They needed to understand silence so they could prepare for withdrawal. So the mind became a lookout tower, always watching, always preparing, always protecting. Healing honors that history instead of rejecting it. Rather than forcing the mind to stop thinking, it acknowledges the purpose behind the noise. The work is not to shame the inner child for being afraid. It's to sit beside them and say, you don't have to guard everything anymore. The mind doesn't calm because it's controlled, it calms because it feels safe. Safety, not perfection, is what transforms the nervous system. Slowly, the alarm bells soften when life stops being a battlefield. The inner child learns that mistakes are allowed, that love doesn't vanish with conflict, that people can stay without needing to be chased or performed for. Healing is a process of replacing fear with evidence of safety, patiently, tenderly, repeatedly. At first, the mind may resist. It may question the peace. It may search for danger even when none exists. This isn't regression, it's memory. A system that spent years protecting you will not shut down just because life became gentler. It needs time. It needs reassurance. It needs compassion rather than impatience. One day the thoughts that once felt like storms begin to sound more like weather, passing, shifting, temporary. You no longer believe every fear. You no longer identify with every worry. You no longer treat every thought as truth. Instead, you listen with softness and decide which ones need attention and which ones can simply drift away. Healing means befriending the mind, not fighting it. It means understanding that overthinking was never the enemy. It was the nervous system trying to keep you alive. And as you grow, as safety becomes familiar rather than rare, the voice that once shouted begins to whisper. The fear that once controlled you begins to loosen. The inner child stops warning and starts resting. So the goal was never silence. The goal was peace. Not the kind that demands perfection, but the kind that allows you to exist with your thoughts, your past, your tenderness, and your hope without fear running the show. Healing softens the mind the way morning light softens the dark. Not by force, but by showing that safety finally exists. In the end, anxious people are not broken, they are wired differently. Their minds are sharp, intuitive, and deeply perceptive. What appears as worry is often wisdom running ahead. With healing and self-compassion, their sensitivity becomes strength, and their overthinking becomes insight. They are not too much. They are powerful minds still learning they no longer need to protect themselves, only express themselves.